In my last video, I discussed Brene Brown's portrayal of sex differences in how men and women interact with shame. Dr. Brown got a few things right. There are sex differences in how men and women interact with shame, and for women, at least, she clearly identifies several areas where they are most vulnerable to attracting feelings of shame. Personal appearance and the ability to do things effortlessly and perfectly color the feelings of self-worth for many women in many cultures. For men, she's less convincing. Do not be perceived as weak, she offers as the overarching theme of male shame, echoing a very popular stereotype, but failing to take into account the considerable depth and versatility of the human male. Brown ignores the innate emotional flexibility of men, choosing to focus on one very specific characteristic, their capacity for violence, which includes hiding weaknesses. In a word, she seems to acknowledge sex differences, but oversimplifies and leaves a lot out. In this video, I'm going to go into more depth about what's missing and why it's significant. I believe Brown's audience would benefit greatly from an evolutionary account of human emotion, as well as what modern neuroscience has to say. There is great value, I think, in trying to understand how shame emerged in humans as an adaptive trait, before attempting to understand how and why shame differs in men and women today. As I mentioned in my first video, I do not think Brown successfully integrated the male sex into her theory of shame resilience. In particular, she does not adequately address female discomfort when men are invited to the party. She says her research shows that women often feel disgust when men express vulnerability. She says, "What I heard over and over from men was this: it's not that women want us to be vulnerable. Women ask us to show vulnerability. They say, I want to know when you're afraid. I want to know when you're scared. I want to know when you're unsure. I want to know when you're struggling." But the truth is, women can't stand it. An overwhelming number of women she spoke to corroborated this. They said when men in their lives expressed vulnerability, they felt disgust, even after they begged their men to be more vulnerable. And here again, we meet our nature-nurture argument. Brown believes that women feel disgust with men expressing vulnerability because they are socially conditioned to. If we look at sex differences from an adaptive viewpoint, however, we might come to a different conclusion. Brown's research appears to show that many women have a conscious desire that is at odds with their unconscious, where there are perhaps deeper inclinations. Many men have caught on. Women ask them for vulnerability, but when men provide it, they get a clearly negative reaction. The fact that women often react negatively to male attempts at vulnerability is well known in folk psychology, that is common knowledge, but in terms of academic study, I know of nothing devoted to the subject. Is it adaptive for women to respond with visceral negativity when men express vulnerability, perhaps in spite of their own conscious desires? This would make sense because, from an evolutionary standpoint, stoic men are of more value to women as consistent providers over men who seek validation by openly expressing fear and weakness. Unfortunately, Brown rejects evolution as a valid avenue of inquiry. Here's what she says about the subject. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, maybe you lead the dinosaur back to my cave, the dinosaur eats my family, I shame you, which translated into group culture, society, that means I shun you or actually push you out from the group, which means you die. That makes sense. Looking back from an evolutionary biological perspective, that makes sense. Today, our ability to understand emotion in ourselves and each other makes shame far too painful to be effective. Brown says we shouldn't try to understand what is most painful to us. I think she needs to reconsider her logic. To the contrary, what is most painful to us should be first on our list to try to understand so that we can control it better. By rejecting evolution from consideration, Brown is clearly marking herself as a social constructionist. The other side of the debate goes something like this. In order to better understand ourselves as a species and as individuals, we should consider what adaptive functions humans may have had in the past to help them survive, including our unique emotional constitution. Paramount to such an inquiry would be the study of shame, often referred to by psychologists as the master emotion, because it is so powerful. There is close to universal agreement that shame helped us to achieve complex social goals. That is, mutually shared activities and achievements that everyone in the community benefited from. In order to share the same goals, people need to share the same values, and shame alerted people when their status within the group was in danger due to acting in some way against their community's values. By administering shame, violence could be avoided, since humans could correct their behavior without injury being involved. And so, shame makes it possible for us to cooperate in a much more sophisticated manner than our great ape cousins, the chimpanzees or orangutans, could. We can achieve goals together that these primates couldn't even conceive of. Brown says, ignore all that because it's too painful. If we decide not to ignore it, one question we might ask at this point is, what complex social goals did humans have that required more sophisticated emotions than other primates have? Well, one goal we can absolutely be certain required a high degree of cooperation was raising the astonishingly challenging human child. It takes decades to raise a child, requiring enormous effort and resources from both men and women, and unlike other primates, human females cannot raise children without assistance. Arguably, the ability for women to shame men is one of the great adaptations in evolutionary history, as it could not be counteracted effectively with violence, meaning they could encourage men strongly to help them raise their children. Men and women, we can be sure, had different rules to follow because their communities had different expectations of them. Does that mean that women could not hunt? No, they probably did. Does that mean that men could not give primary care to children? No, this probably happened also. Human beings are flexible enough for us to be quite sure that roles were somewhat interchangeable. But it does mean that, generally speaking, communities had different expectations for men and women, and over time, men and women adapted to these social expectations with different emotional dispositions that are still visible today, including how we interact with shame and shaming. That is why many researchers think there are differences in what men and women are likely to feel shame about today. For example, there may be an evolved component to women feeling shame about their bodies and appearance. As I mentioned in the previous video, for Brene Brown, the opposite of shame is a sense of belonging in a community. And here I suggest that for many men, it's a little different. The opposite of shame is dignity, respect, pride, and in some cultures, honor. Let's go back a minute and try to apply some of these ideas to examples of shame that Brown brings up in her work. These are all items from her books. They include forgetting to send somebody a birthday card, forgetting to bring cookies to a child's after-school party, not making the cheerleading squad in high school, sending a toddler to daycare so that a parent can return to work. These are the sort of examples we see over and over again in Brown's books. Would shame resilience theory work well for dealing with these issues? You bet. I think discussing them would be very likely to generate feelings of empathy, leading to a sense of belonging. Brown never mentions that these are things that women are more likely to be ashamed about, but I think it's pretty clear that this is a gendered list, and going through the many examples of her work, I noticed that most of them seem directed towards feminine sensibilities. She does not give as many examples that are distinctly male, but she mentions being perceived as weak, being perceived as not violent enough. Would resilience theory work well for these? I'm trying to imagine how the conversation would go. For many men, I don't think so. I hope you can see my point. It is perhaps the case that men evolved in a way to make Brown's resilience theory of less value to them according to their natural inclinations. What does this tell us? Well, it may be the case that women have greater natural ability to solve problems collectively, especially when the problems have higher emotional content. Men, it seems, often first attempt to solve things by themselves. And no, it is not because men are put in a box. Most men are fully capable of getting out of the box when they need to. Here's the point. With any given emotion, there are choices that can be made over how to handle them. Like it or not, there are sex differences involved, and they are not all learned. It is perhaps because over evolutionary time, human males felt greater belonging to a group after providing valuable resources, such as meat from large game animals, which were difficult and dangerous to hunt, and this gave them pride and also brought them honor and dignity, all of which would have been very adaptive, meaning male-styled emotions helped them to survive as well as increase their status. One side effect, though, it also made it of less value for them to reach out to others to discuss their feelings. In my next video, I will be going into more detail about how shame and shaming became central to the shared goal of raising human children and led to human-style pair bonding. Also, I will be discussing the much more complex systems of kinship humans have. After that, we will be ready to talk about shame and shaming in the 21st century and how shame works these days on campus, in our workplaces, online, and just about everywhere else we live and work today. Please be sure to subscribe and hit like so that you will get notified when I publish new material. My name is James Trevor Jackson. I am the creator of shameandshaming.com. I started this site when I noticed that the way we seek to harm each other has changed recently. Shame and shaming is a part of the puzzle. I'm seeking to discover why it has become so much more a part of our everyday life. I hope to see you again. Thanks for watching.